for a humanism which believes in the human because it knows it, to lose. Augustus, Volume 11 Foundations for a Sociology of the Everyday. Translators note this translation is for the people of Amara, who taught me how everyday life can be an art and a festival. It's Suli Duden Liberu how Amaritari Escaints and Diet. Gora Gueta Guterak, except when preceded by trans. Footnotes are from the original when titles appear in French. The quoted material is my own translation. Preface. A moment of radical critique. Michel Trevich. How have the analysts, even master thinkers, of the early 21st century managed to neglect a book as brilliant as the second volume of the Critique of Everyday Life, assuming one has sufficient historical sense to discount the inevitable scoria of the vocabulary of the period, in other words, the ubiquitous Marxist terminology? It must in all honesty be acknowledged that we are dealing with one of the major works of the turn of the 1960s. Henri Lefebvre was then on top intellectual form, productive, creative, publishing some of his most accomplished works and dozens of articles in the space of a few years. The unqualified private college teacher of the interwar period had, in the meantime, become a researcher and, soon afterwards, a recognized if unconventional academic. The communist intellectual, in search of legitimacy with those he always called the official Marxists, made a resounding break with the party, at this point, making him one of the main figures of the contestation that prepared and prefigured the events of May 1968. The gap separating the first and second volumes of the Critique of Everyday Life from 1947 to 1961 is long enough, but not as long as that between the second and third. However, it was marked by various extremely powerful, predominantly political upheavals against the backdrop of the Trente Glorieuses, which meant that everything changed at the beginning of the 1960s, not only for Henri Lefebvre, but as regards the whole ideological and cultural climate. The 1947 book, it may be remembered, derived in large part from the pre-war period and could only have emerged in the short-lived context of the liberation, just before the doors of the Iron Curtain closed shut and the Zhdanov Ice Age set in. Between that date and 1961, nothing less than the trauma of 1956 occurred: the invasion of Hungary, Khrushchev's report, and, for Henri Lefebvre, the start of a fairly slow process of detaching himself from communism in the name of revising Marxism. The key book of a key moment. This volume is presented in a rather remarkable form, explaining precisely these basic changes and, in addition, its author's lucid, even precocious, consciousness of them. Nearly a third of its 350 pages are in fact devoted to clearing the ground, attempting, as Lefebvre indicates, a balance sheet of the transformations in everyday life over the intervening 15 years. The first volume of Critique of Everyday Life already had introduction as its subtitle. These prefatory texts, or inventories, are at one with Henri Lefebvre's approach, the desire constantly to link the conceptual with the experimental, the autobiographical dimension of theoretical reflection, a relationship to experience, in an errant sense of the word. As Lefebvre formulates it with the utmost clarity in his axiomatic chapter, knowledge of society is impossible without a critique of this society. This is the thread that will guide our reading, the essential link, forged during the 1950s, between the political whirlwinds generated by the rift of 1956 and the overall development of the field of the social sciences, especially sociology and its ideological function. What is so interesting about this book is that we have before us a mature work, firm and rigorous in its expression, resolute in its theoretical ambition, and with few equivalents in the rest of Lefebvre's output. It can be read as a veritable discourse on method, in sociology in particular, because it aspires to restore a properly philosophical rigor to the latter, and a determined scholarly stance in Henri Lefebvre which, lifting him out of intellectual marginality, gives all its force to the core of the project, the development of a radical critique of what exists that serves to clarify his trajectory during subsequent years. For what is in play, beyond the second volume of Critique of Everyday Life in the case of Henri Lefebvre, is a longer intellectual history, which could even be extended to Pierre Bourdieu, whose first major works appeared in the very same years. Here, however, we shall confine ourselves to the 1960s, taking the Critique of Everyday Life as a central element in a history of the ideas of May, which, inasmuch as it remains dependent on the effects of fashion and a posteriori reconstructions, remains to be written. If posterity has retained any image of him from the 1960s, it is that of Lefebvre the political agitator, and here we shall indeed be examining the impact of his oeuvre, in particular its influence on the ideas of May 1968, of which Critique of Everyday Life, the second as well as, retroactively the first volume, forms a major component. But a condition of this is that we take the book as a highly theoretical endeavor, unlike the more polemical works of the period, that we recognize in it a surprising contemporaneity in its reading of the social, or what Lefebvre himself defined as the social text, landscapes, cities, streets, that we carefully read his attempt to develop the formal implements and specific categories his terms of the critical sociology. One will retain, for example, the 20 or so pages on the idea of structure, where we find one of the best definitions of structuralism, and also one of the most virulent attacks on it at the very moment when the debate was at its height. But in fact, much more broadly, the sociology that Lefebvre attempted to construct was defined with reference to the two current dominant at the time: quantitative sociology, which he criticized for sticking to enumerations and classifications that cannot exhaust reality, and, equally, participatory sociology, the sociology of surveys and questionnaires postulating a spontaneity of the social rejected by Lefebvre. It is not within my remit to analyze the content and concepts at stake in this sociological controversy, which runs through the book, especially since they are presented presented to readers clearly enough. On the other hand, that controversy makes it possible to grasp what is essential if we are to understand the intellectual history of the 1960s, the fundamental link between sociology and politics, between the institution of contemporary French sociology and attempts to renew revolutionary thought and a rupture with Stalinism. This is the movement, which began well before May 1968, and continued for part of the 1970s. I refer to by the notion of radical critique, a phrase to be found in Lefebvre and others. It is this closely linked relation that I would like to track through the dual trajectory, professional and political, of our philosopher of the everyday. The centre d'études sociologiques. In retrospect, we may start with a commonplace about 1968, according to which sociology and sociologists, students and teachers, were essential driving forces behind the May events, an immature discipline without any openings. Sociology launched the movement of May 1968, wrote Georges Pompidou and Leonard Gaudin, and the idea that sociology was a site of revolutionary thinking because it was a dominated discipline pervades Bourdieu and Passerand's The Inheritors. One of the cult books of the period. For underlying this commonplace are several deeper questions about the development of the discipline after the war, and its role as analyst and catalyst of a certain number of debates about society, as well as about the personal trajectory of Lefebvre who, even though he was now integrated into the university system, remained marginalized with respect both to the royal discipline of philosophy and a party that rejected this particular form of bourgeois science. In 1948, following a brief spell at Radio Toulouse where Tristan Tzara had introduced him at the Liberation, and then a return secondary school teaching, Lefebvre found himself among the 6 researchers appointed to the Centre d'études sociologiques, a laboratories of the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique founded in 1946, briefer still too, by Georges Gervich, whom Georges Friedman was to succeed in 1949. We must say a word about Gervich, an unusual character, the outcast from the horde, as he characterized himself in an article on his intellectual itinerary published in 1966. Just after his death, 5 socialist revolutionary, Gervich was exiled from Russia in 1921, first to Prague and then, in 1924, to Paris, where he took his doctorate in philosophy, before succeeding Maurice Halbwachers at Strasbourg in 1935. Exiled once again during the war to New York, where he worked with the New School for Social Research. He returned to introduce American sociology for the first time and then challenge it. His international openness and personal charisma have often been stressed, but, remaining a philosopher in his references and categories, he was never himself fully integrated into French sociology, and yet, connected to a whole network. Lucien Febvre's 6th section of the École Pratique des Hautes Études and the Conservatoire National des Arts et Métiers, where Georges Friedman was appointed the same year, Gervich represented both the link and the rupture with the Durkheimian legacy, with the sociology of social facts, and it was around him that what has been called the second foundation of French sociology developed after 1945. Hitherto hard to distinguish from social psychology and philosophy, of which it formed one of the diplomas. Sociology had only been represented by a few posts at Paris, Bordeaux and Strasbourg. A generation later, in the 1970s, the main actors in the history of French sociology had passed through this small centre d'études sociologiques, with Henri Lefebvre and Gabriel Lebras around him, and assisted in the secretariat by the marvellous Yvonne Halbwachers, widow of Maurice. Gervich founded the Centre d'études sociologiques with some singular, curious figures, who were rather non-academic and possessed little academic capital. Few were egregious. Their recruitment was a matter of chance, of relations forged in the resistance and political activity. Edgar Morin, while 2 of them came from Urge, Henri Chambard de Law and Geoffroy de Mazière, and of an interest in the working class, which explains the early specialization in the sociology of work Georges Friedman, but also in urban sociology and even the sociology of religion. This is the heroic context in which we must situate the arrival in 1948 of Henri Lefebvre, who had known Friedman since the 1920s and who rapidly became Yvonne Halbwachers' god. Lefebvre was never a Gervichian, but Gervich, engaged with the problem of revolutionary change and defender of a fairly complex vision of a dialectical sociology of the totality, could not but be appreciative of his post-war publications, particularly Critique of Everyday Life. About his entry into the says we possess the testimony of a second-rate novel by François D'Aubin, Le Temps d'apprendre à vivre, where he is depicted in the form of the Marxist philosopher Hervé de Fert, and where she describes the highly politicized atmosphere of the center, several of whose members, like Lefebvre or Morin, were communists. Initially, Lefebvre put considerable effort into the area of rural sociology, creating a rural sociology group in 1950 to which he invited the best French rural scholars Daniel Halévy, Michel Capert, Louis Chevalier, René Dumont, and embarking on area surveys in particular, in the Tuscan countryside in 1950-51. During the war he had worked on the Pyrenean valleys, going through the archives of pastoral communities and discovering in them a kind of primitive communism that had permeated his composition of Critique of Everyday Life. From this research he derived his doctoral thesis on Les Communautés Paysans Pyrénéennes, defended in June 1954, his first academic qualification since his Diplôme d'études supérieures, obtained 30 years earlier in 19,241. His work was marked by a militant dimension, by his links with Italian agricultural unions and even his influence on the Jeunesse agricole chrétienne in France, but also because his empirical research was systematically coupled with theoretical publications on ground rent and agrarian communities, culminating in a tract de sociologie rurale, the manuscript of which seems to have been stolen, and which put him out of tune with the PCF. Then height of its Lysenkoist phase. This political investment was, moreover, to cost him an affair Lefebvre with the directorate of the CNRS. In 1953, during the Journées nationales d'études des intellectuels communistes, in his report on the Cercle des sociologues communistes, he had attacked the police sociology of the bourgeoisie, which indexed the working class, and had 10 set about Goebbels and Friedman by name. The reaction of the CNRS was immediate. The Cold War was then in full swing. He was demoted back down to secondary schools. Lefebvre defended himself in a statement. Protestation de Henri Lefebvre contre la fin de son détachement au CNRS, and a campaign organized by the Researchers Union, led by Alan Turing and Edgar Morin, led to his reinstatement and his being granted tenure as Maître de Recherche on the 12th of October, 1954. Arguments and the revision of Marxism. At this point in time, Lefebvre was already fighting on two fronts. While vis-a-vis bourgeois sociology, he sought to develop the idea of a Marxist sociology. As regards the Communist Party, he had to explain that sociology served a purpose and could not be reduced to bourgeois science. In truth, the misunderstanding went back much further. With the first volume of Critique of Everyday Life, we left Henri Lefebvre verging on the status of official Communist Party philosopher, particularly with his participation in the anti-Sartre offensive and the publication of his short Sage one text La Marxisme, which remains the best-selling text in the collection at Presses Universitaires de France and which, like his 1939 book Dialectical Materialism, was to serve as a reference for generations of Marxist intellectuals. The Idol, it may be remembered, lasted 2 years at most. By 1949, Lefebvre found himself back in the position of marginal communist he had occupied for 30 years, from his adhesion in 1928 to his exclusion in 1958. As early as 1948, the party paralyzed his projects, pulped a work he had already written, Méthodologie des Sciences, and delayed his contribution of aesthetique until 1953, and he was challenged on several occasions in La Nouvelle Critique for his neo-Hegelianism and his intolerable claim to preserve the relative autonomy of 13 philosophy from political imperatives. What actually interested Lefebvre was not proletarian science as defended by Zhdanov from 1947 onwards, still less the relative or absolute immiseration of the proletariat that formed a great debate of the 1950s, and even less Lysenko. What interested him was analyzing the debasement of everyday life in the modern world, marked by the subject's separation from itself and the objectification of the object reduced to reification. 2. The object losing any aesthetic value, to the poverty of the modern world. Nevertheless, the process of breaking with the Communist Party was rather strange and poses the question, formulated by Edgar Morin in the half-tone portrait he drew of Lefebvre in his 1958 auto-critique. Why did this butterfly crawl like a caterpillar for years? Why did Lefebvre remain in the PCF so long? Asks Morin, while suggesting that he paid for his small margin of dialectical autonomy with total political 114 subservience. In fact, in contrast to the successive waves of intellectuals who were excluded from the party or withdrew from it from 1948 onwards, Lefebvre did not make a mark in any of the major crises: the Prague coup, the condemnation of Titoism, the Kravchenko affair, the Rajk trial, the doctors' plot, or even when faced with the earthquake of 1956, the 20th Congress of the CPSU, and then, in October, the Soviet intervention in Hungary, when he had knowledge of Khrushchev's report very early on, as early as February, during a trip to the GDR at the invitation of the Berlin Academy of Sciences. This was because his problem was more theoretical than directly political in this sense. The first shock dates back to 1955, on the occasion of a lecture on Lucas to the Hungarian Institute of Paris, when Lefebvre, while polemicizing with Raymond Aron, the opium of the intellectuals, and Merleau-Ponty, Adventures of the Dialectic, rejected the Zhdanovite thesis of proletarian science, attacked in the communist press, he copped a warning from the party leadership, which prevented 16 publication of his lecture. The key question for Lefebvre, as for a number of intellectuals at the time, was the crisis of orthodoxy and the revision of Marxism. The main anchorage point of this challenge was to be the Journal Arguments, founded in 1956 and wound up by its editors in 1962, in which the prime movers were Edgar Morin, Jean 17 Duvignard and Kostas Axlos, a research bulletin. Rather than the organ of a group, this journal gathered together thinkers excluded from the PCF and a number of people from the socialist left who wanted to renovate socialism. Before and after the 20th Congress, the initiative of these revolutionary intellectuals was to seek to renew Marxism by all available means. Lefebvre himself only published 2 articles in it, and following his exclusion from the Communist Party, one in 1959, Justice et Vérité, on Nietzsche, the other in 1962, La Signification de la Commune, a loose grouping round arguments sought to rethink French society, particularly after de Gaulle's victory, which posed some new problems, to rethink modern civilization, the reign of bureaucracy, technique, the new working class, Serge Mallet, fragmented work, Georges Friedman, to rethink international relations by posing the question of the third world, in the name of a methodological position that consisted in trying to reason the meaning of ragionamenti, the title of the Italian journal that worked with them, to pose questions and not to try to offer an interpretative line on Marxism. They pondered a keyword alienation rediscovered via the young Marx and Lucas, Lucien Goldman's Hidden God, Pierre Naville's thesis De l'aliénation la jouissance, Roland Barthes's mythologies, all these works from 1956-57, which coincided with the evolution of annales towards the longue durée, shifted examination towards the everyday and modernity. Lefebvre's contribution to the question in this period was to be his long long introduction to the second edition of Critique of Everyday Life, in which he sought to examine what had changed between 1947 and 1958 in the modern world, and where he refocused on the question of alienation. In addition, arguments opened itself to foreign currents, the Frankfurt School, Lucas, Marcuse, Kolakowski, alongside the various movements attempting to revise Marxism in France. We should in fact introduce a series of international dimensions, whether the shock of Algeria, or Cuba, or Yugoslav self-management, and later that of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. However, the main point here is to clarify the parallel between debates on the revision of Marxism and debates on the function of sociology, just as argument served, in Remy Riefel's phrase, as a political decompression chamber for the exit from Stalinism. So the Centre d'études sociologiques and the Cahiers internationaux de sociologie, founded by Gurvitch, served as a scientific 118 and cultural decompression chamber. It was in part the same authors who confronted each other in both Morin, Duvignaud, Ballandier, Touraine, Naville, so that it is legitimate to define an axis extending from sociological research to the journals and magazines that relayed these questions to a wider public. Esprit, La Nouvelle Observateur, and the recurrent themes of surveys and colloquia clearly prefiguring many of the concerns of 1968, fashion, needs, social classes, urbanization, technical society and civilization, tradition and continuity, the sociology of change, prediction and sociology, the critique of modernity. For this dual debate assumed a public character. Lefebvre's opposition to the party line had long been internal, notably within the oppositional cell of the Centre d'études sociologiques, but it soon extended to the fractional groups Celestin Cell, Victor Leduc, Jean-Pierre Vernant, Helen Parmelin, Maurice Caving, Maxime Rodinson, in 1957 and, above all, Vols Nouvelles in April 1958, where he published several articles, in particular, a set on Marxist theory de l'information. In the first two issues that attracted 19 lots of attention. This was the context in which Lefebvre published an article that was key in everything that happened thereafter. La Marxisme et la pensée francaise, which drew up a disastrous balance sheet of the theoretical regression of Stalinist dogmatism, published in the Polish journal Tworzosk at the end of 1956, released in June 1957. In France Observateur and in July-August in Les Temps Modernes. The article earned him exclusion from the editorial committee of 20 this La Nouvelle Critique along with various others. Analysis was resumed and extended at the beginning of 1958 in Problems Actuels du Marxisme, published by 21 Presses Universitaires de France. At the same time, he participated, together with the Temps Modernes Circle and the Mendicist Left, Bourdieu, Martinet, around the Club de la Gauche, in a number of discussions on the New Left and the New Working Class that led to the foundation of the SAR and then the SU, which Lefebvre never joined. He was to be criticized for all this, but it was on political grounds that a procedure to exclude him was initiated in June 1958. He was criticized for his prolonged activity of breaking away, through publications in the bourgeois press, L'Express, France Observateur, the NRF, Les Temps Modernes, his revisionist works, Problems Actuels du Marxisme, and his blatant fractional activity in participating in the Club de la Gauche in oppositional publications, Vols 22 Nouvelles, pronounced for a year. The exclusion would in fact prove definitive. He would never return, despite the lines thrown him at the beginning of the 1980s by a party only too happy, in times of famine, to have a last intellectual to digest. This exclusion calls for three observations. The first is the violence of the attacks the PCF unleashed against him, launching against the Quarriette intellectuals Gilbert Murray, Guy Bessy, André Giselbrecht, Lucien Sèvres, Jean Canepa, and making him a privileged target at its 15th Congress. The virulence was commensurate with the extreme patience of the PCF. 23 to adopt the phrase of Lucien Sèvres from 1960. This was because the loss of Henri Lefebvre was, as David Cote indicates in his classic Communism and the French 24 Intellectuals, a heavy blow for the party. But it was also the case second observation that, whatever the official grounds, the virulence and vulgarity of these attacks were directed at an intellectual, not a political figure. Henri Lefebvre is a unique example of an intellectual, a philosopher, excluded for his ideas. Althusser was not excluded and, as for Garaudy, it was the Politburo member who was ousted. If the political break was obviously fundamental in allowing Lefebvre to develop his thinking in total freedom, there was no real theoretical discontinuity in his desire to construct a living Marxism, freed from dogmatism and committed to the analysis of contemporary phenomena. Certainly, he responded to his exclusion by publishing an initial analysis, Elle exclut Inclet, in Les Temps Modernes as early as July 1958. Above all, as if it represented a veritable liberation for him, he threw himself into the composition of La Somme et le reste, that strange narrative of a philosophical adventure, which remains for many his major work. 25 From revolutionary romanticism to the Situationists having entered a romantic, Lefebvre left a romantic, wrote Maurice Blanchett in the fine portrait Slow Funeral. He drew with him an amity. If he stayed, it is because he believed it possible, thanks to the position he occupied, to maintain an opening, even if it sometimes meant playing a double game. Philosopher's head is a hard head, even unbreakable. In the interim, Lefebvre published another article in the NRF, drawing less fire from party intellectuals, which was different in scope and destined to have a different echo in the coming decade. This article, Vers un romantisme révolutionnaire, taken up and reworked on several occasions, notably in the Introduction to Modernity in 1962, ushered in his phase of radical critique, making it possible for him to quit the Communist Party from the lefty 27 in this text. Lefebvre revived the 1925 ideal of a revolution that could only succeed if it extended not merely to the Economic 126. Infrastructure, but to mentalities and culture, that set out, hence the notion of revolutionary romanticism from the critique of modernity which was for him at the heart of 19th century romanticism, from a refusal of the modern world. This romanticism must be oriented towards the production of over and the production of man himself, what Lefebvre, like many people in the Stalinist era, called the new man. This text seems to me be essential for understanding the process of rupture and the various developments in which he was engaged from 1956 to 1958, but first, in order to appreciate his sensational entry into radical critique properly, we must resituate Henri Lefebvre in the context of the scholarly legitimacy he acquired at the turn of the 1960s. Contrary to retrospective reconstructions, we may note that sociology was now no longer quite what it had been in 1945-46, when he joined the SES. As early as 1946, Gurvitch had launched the Cahiers Internationaux de Sociologie, the first such journal since the disappearance of the Annales de Sociologie, under the direction of Friedman. The SES, installed in 1951 with the École Pratique des Hautes Études on the Rue de Varenne, had already been transformed into a genuine laboratories, conducting area surveys, forming research groups, while Gurvitch, appointed to the Sorbonne, launched the Bibliothèque de Sociologie Contemporaine at Presses Universitaires de France, and directed the French version of a big tract de sociologie long regarded as authoritative. The Gurvitch era was succeeded by the era of Stoessel. Jean Stoessel, a Sorbonne professor at the same time as Raymond Aron, became director of the SES in 1956. Appointments to it now speeded up. In the academy, a key turning point occurred with the creation in 1958 of a degree in sociology, which thus became an academic discipline in its own right. The same year, Gurvitch founded the Association Internationale des Sociologues de Langue Francaise, relying on a system of publications, with editions and for augmenting Presses Universitaires de France, and multiplying through the foundation of several journals alongside the Cahiers, particularly the Revue Francaise de Sociologie. These were the years of major colloquia and public visibility for the 29, the turning point represented by Stoessel, discipline, who had staked out his position as early as 1946 in a kind of manifesto. L'esprit de la sociologie contemporaine was still more profound on the methodological and ideological level, in demanding an empirical and even neo-positivist sociology, primarily preoccupied with quantitative techniques and indifferent to theory. Stoessel consciously and explicitly established the discipline in the framework of the dominant ideology, and, more specifically, as a site of intellectual elaboration of major reforms implemented at the beginning of the Fifth Republic as regards technological modernization, planning, and national and regional development, data. If this development cannot quite be reduced to a victory of American sociology, it did at least mark a crucial reorientation and explains the reaction of Henri Lefebvre and several other Marxist sociologists, Edgar Morin, Pierre Naville, who at just this moment were embarked upon the enterprise of revising Marxism and who proposed, in various forms, a much more militant vision of sociology. For Lefebvre, this was expressed by the abandonment of rural sociology, an area in which he was replaced by Henri Mendres, who would direct his research towards the Second French Revolution, the end of the peasantry and France's entry into modernity. In the account of research in the SES in 1959, published in the first issue of the Revue Francaise de Sociologie, 1960, Lefebvre's themes were as follows. 1. Research on needs and the framework of the family, how mothers see the needs of children. Sociology of everyday life, theory of needs, research into needs in the family framework. 2. The birth of a city like and Morinx. 3. Monographs on villages. We are at the pivotal point of an evolution that was going to lead towards urban sociology and, more broadly, a sociology of daily life. Thus, in 1960 Lefebvre created a research group on everyday life at the SES. It was at this point, the production of volume 11 of Critique of Everyday Life, that he was to quit research for university teaching, elected as a professor. In October 1961, he was appointed by the liberal philosopher Georges Gusdorf to the sociology chair in the faculty at Strasbourg, formerly held by Gurvitch, where he would remain until his election to Nanterre in 1965, developing an academic practice that was self-directed in character, particularly with the creation of an autonomous department of applied sociology. His reputation with the bourgeoisie of Strasbourg rapidly became inflammatory, and his courses would mainly attract those students most disposed to protest. This is the manifold context in which the passing but striking encounter between Henri Lefebvre and the Situationist group must be placed. 30. The influence was to be fertile and mutual for Lefebvre, who revived the strategy of rupture of the 1920s avant-garde, and for the Situationists who, prior to heaping abuse on him, drew much of their theoretical inspiration from his work. Founded in 1957 around Guy Debord, Raoul Vaneigem, Asbjörn and Constant, the Situationist International was itself the inheritor of several movements like the Lettrist International of Isidore Isou and above all Cobra I Copenhagen, Brussels, Amsterdam, created in 1948 and dissolved in 1951, with which Lefebvre maintained relations, as is indicated by his correspondence with the Belgian poet D'Autremont, or his influence on Constant, Nieuwenhuis, who was to draw upon the Critique of Everyday Life for his initial urban projects in the New Babylon. But it was Indeed, the article Vers un romantisme révolutionnaire that prompted Lefebvre's encounter with the board, as early as the first issue of International Situationiste, the Theses sur la Révolution culturelle, were explicitly constructed with reference to that article. Lefebvre offers us a track for critique of the contemporary world, but he does not propose a political project for making the revolution. From the outset, as we can see, the relations between Lefebvre and the Situationists were complicated and critical. They were not of the order of filiation or affiliation, and, as the Situationist International made clear during their rupture, he was never a member of the movement. But it was with the thought of Henri Lefebvre that the Situationists were fundamentally in dialogue, and there was even a phase of shared existence, trips, stays in Lefebvre's house in the Pyrenees, genuine collaboration. Since Lefebvre involved the board in the work of his research group on 31 everyday life within the SES, for a start, both parties had in common the idea that everyday life is governed in the modern world by the reign of scarcity, not by the wealth of the consumer society, that everyday life has become disconnected from historicity amidst industrialization and accumulation, that it has been debased into uniform, repetitive everydayness by its separation from the great cosmic, natural and vital cycles, that the individual is a self-divided, this is Deleuze's capitalism, and schizophrenia, separated from herself and the world in the modern world. Such alienation can be expressed in terms of poverty. Guy Debord came to give a talk to the research group on everyday life in 1961, in which he launched the saying everyday life is literally colon as EDI 130 to this was a saying with a prosperous future ahead of it, expressly quoted by Lefebvre in the second volume of Critique of Everyday Life. It was to be met with again in 1967 in the Manifesto on the Poverty of Student Life, and would even reach as far as Habermas in 1981. In his Theory of Communicative Action, which contains a whole chapter on the colonization of the everyday, it was in response to this poverty and alienation that the Situationists developed a theory of revolution, even cultural revolution, in terms of revolutions in individual everyday life, which is at the root of the theory of situations. In their most theoretical text, Theorie des moments et construction des situations, they in fact defined themselves with reference to the theory of moments, developed by Lefebvre in La Somme et le Reste and then in Critique of Everyday 35 Life. Spatio-temporal, constructed situations, are said to supersede moments as so many procedures for rupture, acceleration, subversion with respect to daily life, particularly the Situationist derive, close to the Surrealist promenade, which consists in passing so rapidly from one district to another that an effect of acceleration and fluidity, breaking with the everyday, is created. The main site of experimentation is the city, but also as an object of experimental town planning, an anti-Le Corbusier city, constructed to counter uniformity, based on an architecture of the labyrinth, of complexity, which makes it possible not to take reality for such. But there is a divergence between Lefebvre and the Situationists over what utopia consists in. Abstract utopia or concrete utopia. Is experimenting with a different kind of city a concrete utopia that already forms part of the revolution? Or does it remain at the level of architectural designs? 34 It was here that the tensions were to crystallize. The Situationists were to be stymied by the eternal problem of avant-garde since the Surrealists, the difficulty, even impossibility, of articulating cultural revolution and political revolution, as early as the first issue of International Situationiste, and again in number 31 sur le dépareissement de l'art, December 1959. The Situationists had criticized Lefebvre, and indeed Goldman, both defined as representatives of independent revolutionary thinking, for having nothing to offer on the organization of a political force. But it was Lefebvre's relations with the New Left, particularly with what they dubbed argumentist Young, that led to the rupture. The Situationists could not accept the revision of the 1957 text Vers un nouveau romantisme taken up again by Lefebvre in 1962 in Introduction to Modernity, where he related situationism to this new romanticism and reduced the group to a youth movement. 35 Above all, at the same time Lefebvre published an article on La Signification de la Commune, in the last issue of Arguments, foreshadowing his 1965 book La Proclamation de la Commune. 36 These few pages had been requested by him from Debord and Venetian, who defined the Commune as the greatest festival of the 19th century. This was the key theme of the revolution as festival, which would dominate the whole of May 1968, but in 1962 it was the occasion for the violent break with Lefebvre, consigned to the dustbin of history, and accused of being a plagiarist, a renegade, a Versailles 137 of culture. Starting from there, we could, notwithstanding the sensational rupture, expatiate on the basically fairly direct influence of Henri Lefebvre, appointed in the Interim Tenantaire in 1965, on situationist texts that would serve as a theoretical reference point for May 1968, especially Guy Debord's The Society of the Spectacle and Raoul Venetian's The Revolution of Everyday Life, both of which were published in 1967. Did the radical critique characteristic of Henri Lefebvre's position at the time, and which aligns him with the current of critical theory and unorthodox Marxism, have an immediate impact on a movement that accorded more importance to cultural revolution, the seizure of symbolic power, and seizing speech, than reversing economic and social infrastructures, and capturing state power, rather than responding to that question? By way of conclusion, I should like to take a different tack, starting from recent works on Michel de Certeau and the comparison that might be sketched between the author of Critique of Everyday Life and the author of the Practice of 38 Everyday Life. The works of Henri Lefebvre on everyday life were a fundamental source for de Certeau, as he signaled in the general introduction to his book. 39 Unquestionably, the two-part company on numerous points, notably the historical apprehension of daily life, which is relocated by the philosopher in A History of Modernity, reality, whereas the historian confines himself to a phenomenology of social micro-behavior pitched at the level of the longue durée. But they coincide, particularly with respect to Marcuse and his pessimistic definition of the consumer society, in a reading of consumption not as sheer passivity within mechanisms of domination, but as a form of production. Production of a different kind that comes to disrupt the established order, the anti-discipline that is at the heart of de Certeau's thinking. As of Michel Foucault's In On the Edge of the Cliff, Roger Chartier has provided a fine analysis of a central hypothesis of the practice of everyday life, to a rationalized, expansionist and at the same time centralized, clamorous, and spectacular production corresponds another. Production, called consumption. The latter is devious, it is dispersed, but it insinuates itself everywhere, silently and almost invisibly, because it does not manifest itself through its own products, but rather through its ways of using the products imposed by a 140 dominant economic order, and it is above all here that we detect a proximity, even a direct influence of Lefebvre on de Certeau, on the basis of some fundamental ideas in de Certeau about tactics and strategies. The terms, which are quite explicit and analyzed at length, are to be found in Lefebvre, as a development of the Marxist concept of praxis, in volume 11 of Critique of Everyday Life, which de Certeau read very closely. In it Lefebvre precisely defines the critique of everyday life as a theory of tactics and strategies. Tactics referring to the everyday, to stagnant and trivial reality, and strategy to the domain of action 41 and decision making. We can even go somewhat further, if invention in de Certeau is not that far removed from critique in Lefebvre. Here is to be found the genealogy of the very idea of a science of daily life, which has been so essential in the recent renewal of the social sciences. Insofar as the science of man exists, it finds its material in the trivial, the everyday, Lefebvre asserted as early as 1947. With reference to Marc Bloch 42, this attention in Lefebvre to familiar gestures, to what he elsewhere calls the minor magic in everyday life, even treated in terms of survivals, certainly does not make him the grandfather of microstoria, but definitely does open up the path to a contemporary reflection on the complexity of the forms of experience, and the role of an anthropological approach to the critique of modernity. CNRS, Paris, June 2002, translated by Gregory Elliott. Clearing the